Midnight Ledger Audio presents an investigation into the impossible, the case of Mary Reeser, a documentary on the terrifying mystery of spontaneous human combustion. Fire is the oldest tool known to humanity. It is predictable. It is bound by the strict, unyielding laws of physics and chemistry. To burn, a fire requires three things: oxygen, heat, and fuel. Remove one, and the beast starves. When a typical house fire ignites, it is a chaotic spreading force. It climbs walls. It jumps from curtains to carpets. It consumes everything in its path until the fuel is gone or the flames are suffocated. It does not discriminate. It does not localize. But what happens when fire breaks its own rules? What happens when an inferno, burning at temperatures hot enough to melt iron, confines itself to a single terrifyingly small circle? On the morning of July 2, 1951, the quiet retirement community of St. Petersburg, Florida, was confronted with a scene that defied logic, science, and nature. In a small ground-floor apartment, a 67-year-old woman named Mary Reeser was consumed by a blaze of unprecedented ferocity. Yet the newspapers sitting just inches away from her remained unscorched. The paint on the walls did not blister. The apartment did not burn down. Mary Reeser, a woman who weighed 170 pounds, nothing remained but a pile of white ash, a few pieces of bone, a shrunken skull the size of a teacup, and one perfectly preserved left foot, still wearing its black satin slipper. This is not a ghost story. This is a documented forensic nightmare. Welcome to the comprehensive hour-by-hour investigation into the most famous case of alleged spontaneous human combustion in history. To understand the sheer shock of this tragedy, we must first understand the setting. In 1951, St. Petersburg, Florida was known as the Sunshine City. It was a haven for retirees, a tranquil paradise where the post-war boom had brought thousands of Americans seeking a quiet, warm place to live out their twilight years. The streets were lined with palm trees and modest, pastel-colored boarding houses. Crime was low. The biggest excitements were local bingo games and the arrival of the Daily Mail. Mary Reeser was one of these transplants. She was 67 years old, a widow who had recently moved down from Columbia, Pennsylvania. She didn't come to Florida for the beaches. She came to be closer to her son, Dr. Richard Reeser, a well-respected local physician. Mary rented a modest efficiency apartment at 1200 Cherry Street. It was owned by a woman named Pansy Carpenter, who lived right next door in the same building. Mary's apartment was simple, comfortable, and mundane. It had a bed, a small kitchenette, and her favorite piece of furniture, a large, overstuffed, comfortable armchair where she spent most of her days. Mary was not a woman of mystery. She was a typical grandmother. She enjoyed a quiet life, but she had her vices. Mary was a heavy smoker, and like many people of her era dealing with the aches, pains, and anxieties of aging, she had a prescription for Seconal, a powerful barbiturate used as a sleeping pill. It was a combination that would later become the cornerstone of the FBI's official theory: a heavy smoker, highly flammable nightclothes, and sedatives. But as we will soon see, the official theory fails to explain the horrific, impossible physics of the aftermath. Sunday, July 1st, 1951. It was a sweltering, humid Florida evening. At around 8 p.m., Mary had visitors. Her son, Dr. Richard Reeser, and his wife dropped by the apartment to check on her. Mary was sitting in her favorite overstuffed armchair. She was wearing a rayon nightgown, a lightweight robe, and a pair of black satin slippers. Dr. Reeser later recalled that his mother seemed perfectly normal, though slightly agitated. She had been talking about returning to Pennsylvania for a visit, feeling a bit homesick for her old friends. She mentioned she had taken 2 of her Seconal sleeping pills because she wanted to ensure a good night's rest. When Richard and his wife stood up to leave, they said their goodbyes. Richard kissed his mother, told her he loved her, and walked out the door. He noted the time. It was roughly 8:30 p.m. As the door clicked shut, Mary Reeser was entirely alone. Let us freeze this moment. Let us look at the variables in the room. Variable 1, the Seconal. 2 pills were already in her system, beginning to slow her heart rate and dull her senses. Variable 2, the clothing. Rayon in the 1950s was highly combustible. It was a synthetic fabric that, when exposed to flame, didn't just burn, it melted and clung to the skin. Variable 3, the cigarette. Mary sat in the armchair and lit up a final cigarette for the evening. Outside, the neighborhood grew quiet. Pansy Carpenter, the landlady next door, went to sleep. Sometime in the dead of night, the timeline goes black. There were no screams, there were no alarms. No one in the building heard a struggle. But at 4:20 a.m., the wall clock in Mary Reeser's apartment suddenly stopped. The internal gears, made of metal, had melted and fused together from a sudden massive surge of ambient heat. In the silence of the early morning, an inferno of unimaginable intensity was raging inside room 1. But it wasn't burning the room. It was only burning Mary. Monday morning, 8 a.m. Pansy Carpenter woke up and went about her morning routine. A telegraph boy arrived at the front door holding a message for Mary Reeser. Pansy signed for it and walked down the short hallway to Mary's apartment. She stood outside the door and knocked. Silence. She called out Mary's name. Nothing. Pansy reached out and grasped the brass doorknob to let herself in. She gasped and yanked her hand back. The metal knob was searing hot. It burned her palm. Panic set in. Pansy ran out of the building and screamed for help. 2 painters who were working across the street heard the commotion and ran over. Together, they forced the door to Mary's apartment open. A blast of hot air hit them in the face. It wasn't the raging heat of an active fire, but the stifling, suffocating heat of an oven that had just been turned off. The apartment was filled with a strange, greasy, sweet-smelling black smoke. It clung to the walls. It coated the ceiling in an oily soot. The painters, coughing from the smoke, crept into the room. They looked toward the center of the apartment, where Mary's armchair usually sat. The armchair was gone. Mary was gone. In their place was a blackened, charred circle on the floor, roughly 4 feet in diameter. The springs of the armchair were lying bare on the ground, and within the ashes lay the gruesome remnants of Mary Reeser. The police were called immediately. When Police Chief J.R. Reichert arrived, even his seasoned detectives were completely paralyzed by what they saw. Let us detail the forensic nightmare of the crime scene. To reduce a human body to ash, you need a crematorium. A modern crematorium operates at temperatures between 1,400 and 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, burning consistently for 3 to 4 hours. Even then, large bone fragments remain and must be mechanically ground into dust. Yet here in a residential apartment, Mary Reeser's 170-pound body had been almost entirely incinerated. Only a few grisly fragments remained. 1. A section of her backbone. 2. A severely shrunken skull, reduced to the size of a baseball or a teacup. 3. And sticking out from the edge of the ash circle, completely untouched by the flames, was Mary's left foot. It was severed cleanly at the ankle, still wearing its black satin slipper. But the true impossibility of the scene wasn't just what was burned, it was what was not burned. Just inches away from the blackened circle of ash sat a stack of newspapers. They were completely intact. They weren't even singed. The paint on the walls adjacent to the chair was peeling from the ambient heat, but the wood was not scorched. The bedsheets nearby were clean. How does a fire burn at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, completely incinerating human bone, but fail to ignite a dry newspaper sitting just 12 inches away? The local police were out of their depth. The coroner was baffled. By the end of the week, the investigation would escalate all the way to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. The world was about to be introduced to the terrifying concept of spontaneous human combustion. When the local authorities stepped into Mary Reeser's apartment on July 2, 1951, they were completely unequipped for the forensic anomaly that lay before them. Police Chief J.R. Reichert and local coroner Dr. Edward F. Woods stood at the edge of the blackened 4-foot circle. Above them, the ceiling was coated in a thick, oily black soot. But what immediately caught the attention of the detectives was the distinct heat line. Fire behaves according to the laws of thermodynamics. Heat rises. In room 1, there was a perfectly straight line drawn across the walls, exactly 4 feet off the ground. Above this line, plastic light switches had melted and dripped down the walls like wax. The wall clock had stopped at 4:20 a.m., its internal gears fused together. The candles on the dresser had melted into puddles, their wicks resting in hardened pools of wax. But below this 4-foot line, nothing. A pile of newspapers sitting on a small table right next to the charred remains of the armchair was perfectly intact. A telephone book lay unburnt. The paint on the lower half of the walls was untouched. The carpet outside the immediate 4-foot circle of the chair was completely pristine. Dr. Woods examined the remains. To incinerate a human body to this degree requires a sustained temperature of roughly 2,500 to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. If a fire of that magnitude had ignited in the center of the room, The radiant heat alone should have instantly ignited the newspapers, the bed sheets, and the wooden furniture. The entire apartment building should have burned to the foundation, yet here was Mary Reeser, reduced to white ash, a few pieces of vertebra, a bizarrely shrunken skull, and one perfectly unburnt left foot. Chief Reichert knew his local department could not solve this. He gathered the ashes and bone fragments, placed them into a secure box, and sent an urgent letter to Washington, D.C. The letter was addressed directly to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Reichert wrote,
"We request any information or theories that could explain how a human body could be so destroyed and the fire confined to such a small area and so little damage done to the structure of the building and the furniture in the room, not even scorched or damaged by smoke."
The FBI took the case, and they brought with them a forensic theory that would become the cornerstone of modern fire investigation. On August 8, 1951, the FBI laboratory released its official report on the death of Mary Reeser. They firmly rejected the sensational headlines of spontaneous human combustion. The Bureau did not believe in magic, curses, or supernatural ignition. They believed in chemistry. To explain the impossible physics of Room 1, the FBI introduced a concept known as the Wick Effect, sometimes referred to as the candle effect. To understand this phenomenon, we must break down the anatomy of a candle. A candle is composed of two parts: a wick, usually made of cotton or twine, and a fuel source, the wax. When you light the wick, the flame melts the wax immediately surrounding it. The liquid wax is then drawn up into the wick through capillary action. The wax vaporizes and burns, producing a steady, localized, and long-lasting flame. The wick itself doesn't burn away quickly. It merely acts as the delivery mechanism for the fuel. Now, apply this horrific chemistry to a human being. Mary Reeser was a stout woman. She weighed approximately 170 pounds, meaning her body contained a significant amount of adipose tissue, human fat. Human fat is highly combustible. Its chemical composition is remarkably similar to the tallow used to make early candles. The FBI theorized the following timeline. At approximately 9 p.m., Mary took her seconal sleeping pills. As the heavy barbiturates took effect, she fell into a deep, unshakable, chemically induced sleep in her armchair. She was smoking a cigarette. As she lost consciousness, the lit cigarette slipped from her fingers and landed on her lap. Mary was wearing a nightgown made of acetate or rayon, highly flammable synthetic fabrics common in the 1950s. The cigarette smoldered. It ignited the rayon. The fabric burned through her skin and breached the subcutaneous layer of fat. As the fat melted from the localized heat of the burning clothes, it soaked into the charred remains of her nightgown and the upholstery of the armchair. The fabric of her clothes and the chair acted exactly like the wick of a candle. Once this gruesome process began, it became self-sustaining. The FBI stated that the fire didn't need to be 3,000 degrees to destroy her body. A Wick Effect fire burns at a much lower, localized temperature, around 500 to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But it burns slowly, for hours. Through the dead of night, the fire fed on Mary's own body fat. Because it was a slow, smoldering burn rather than an explosive blaze, the flames never reached high enough to catch the ceiling or spread outward. The smoke, heavy with vaporized human fat, rose to the ceiling, creating the oily soot and melting the plastic switches above the 4-foot heat line. As for the unburnt foot, it was wrapped in a tight slipper and propped up, away from the core of the melting fat. The fire simply ran out of fuel before it could reach her extremity. The FBI closed their report. They declared the death an accidental fire caused by a dropped cigarette and sustained by the Wick Effect. To the Bureau, the case was closed, but to the physical anthropologist who actually examined Mary Reeser's bones, the FBI's theory possessed one glaring, impossible flaw. Enter Dr. Wilton Krogman. Dr. Krogman was a professor of physical anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. He was one of the world's foremost experts on the effects of fire on the human skeleton. He was consulted by the local St. Petersburg police to make sense of the bone fragments recovered from the ashes. When Dr. Krogman reviewed the evidence, he was deeply unsettled. He publicly disagreed that the Wick Effect could explain the totality of the destruction. His primary objections centered on the most macabre detail of the entire case: Mary Reeser's skull. According to the official police report and the coroner on the scene, Mary's skull had not been reduced to ash. Instead, it had shrunk. It was found in the ashes, perfectly intact, but reduced to the size of a teacup. To understand why this terrified Dr. Krogman, you must understand how human bone reacts to extreme heat. The human skull is a closed container housing the brain and cerebrospinal fluid. When a skull is exposed to the intense heat of a fire, the fluid inside begins to boil. The resulting steam creates massive internal pressure. In almost all recorded forensic cases of victims trapped in intense fires, the skull does not shrink. It expands, cracks, and often violently explodes outward due to the pressure. In controlled cremation settings where temperatures reach 2000 degrees, the skull bones shatter and calcine. They become brittle and break apart. There is no known physiological or chemical mechanism by which a human skull exposed to fire shrinks evenly and symmetrically to the size of a baseball while maintaining its structural integrity. Dr. Krogman wrote,
I find it hard to believe that a human body, once ignited, will literally consume itself. As I review it, the short hairs on my neck bristle with vague fear. Were I living in the Middle Ages, I'd mutter something about black magic.
Furthermore, Krogman noted that to consume bone to the degree seen in the ashes, the fire would have required temperatures far exceeding the 1000 degrees generated by a slow Wick Effect fire. He estimated it would take a fire burning at 3000 degrees Fahrenheit to leave so little bone behind. If the fire was 3000 degrees, the apartment should have burned to the ground. If the fire was only 1000 degrees, there should have been a nearly complete skeleton remaining in the chair. The evidence completely contradicted itself. The physics were broken. The FBI stood by their Wick Effect conclusion, ignoring the anomaly of the skull, chalking it up to an illusion caused by the neck vertebrae fusing to the remaining bone fragments, making it appear like a small skull to the untrained eye of the local police. But Dr. Krogman, a world-class expert, remained unconvinced. Mary Reeser's death was officially ruled an accident. Her remains were quietly buried in a cemetery in Pennsylvania. But the questions she left behind in those ashes refused to be buried with her. The Wick Effect provided law enforcement with a comforting, scientific explanation. It allowed the citizens of St. Petersburg to sleep at night, believing that Mary Reeser was the victim of a tragic but entirely natural chain reaction. But science is not a religion of comfort. It is a pursuit of truth, and the truth of Room 1 was that the evidence did not fully align with the solution. If a dropped cigarette and human fat could cause such total contained incineration, why isn't it a more common occurrence? Millions of people fall asleep while smoking every year. Why do they usually suffer severe surface burns or burn their houses down rather than turning into a pile of localized ash? Why did her skull shrink? Why did the heat stop perfectly at the 4-foot mark? The FBI closed the door on the Mary Reeser case, but in doing so, they inadvertently opened the door to decades of independent researchers, fringe scientists, and paranormal investigators, all seeking to answer the question, is spontaneous human combustion real? To understand the sheer terror that gripped the investigators in Mary Reeser's apartment, we have to look backward. We have to look at the history of a phenomenon so deeply unsettling that modern science has spent over 2 centuries trying to bury it. Spontaneous human combustion, or SHC. The idea that a human being could simply burst into flames without an external spark seems like the stuff of medieval folklore. And for a long time it was. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was widely believed that severe alcoholics could saturate their bodily tissues with so much liquor that they became highly combustible. The concept became deeply embedded in the cultural zeitgeist. In 1853, Charles Dickens published his masterpiece, Bleak House. In it, a heavy-drinking, corrupt merchant named Mr. Crook mysteriously perishes. When characters enter his room, they find only a pile of ashes, a dark, greasy soot coating the walls, and a foul, suffocating odor. Dickens defended his use of SHC in his novel, citing a handful of historical medical records. Eminent scientists of the day, such as the German chemist Justus von Liebig, vehemently attacked Dickens. Liebig proved mathematically and chemically that a human body, which is composed of roughly 60% water, cannot spontaneously ignite, no matter how much alcohol the person consumed. The scientific community declared SHC a myth, an anatomical impossibility, a Gothic fairy tale used to scare drunkards into sobriety, but science relies on observation, and occasionally, history throws an observation into the record that completely shatters the accepted rules. Mary Reeser was not the first Cinder Lady. To understand the anomalies in Room 1 in 1951, we must travel back to Italy, to the year 1731, and examine a case that is almost a mirror image of the St. Petersburg tragedy. The city of Cesena, Italy, April 4th, 1731. Countess Cornelia Zangari-Bandi was 62 years old. She was a noblewoman, known to be in relatively good health, though she reportedly suffered from lethargy and was accustomed to rubbing her body with camphorated spirits, a highly flammable alcohol-based remedy to soothe her aching joints. On the evening of April 3rd, after a quiet family dinner, the Countess felt dull and heavy. Her maid accompanied her to her bedchamber, spent several hours talking with her, and then left her to sleep. The next morning, when the maid returned to wake her mistress, she opened the heavy wooden door to the bedchamber. The room was not on fire, but the air was thick, choked with a heavy, foul-smelling smoke. The window panes were coated in a strange, yellowish, oily fluid that dripped down the glass. The Countess was not in her bed. The bedclothes were tossed aside, indicating she had gotten up during the night. The maid looked toward the center of the room, near the window. There on the floor lay a horrifying scene that would be meticulously documented by the Italian physician Reverend Joseph Bianchini. Bianchini's official medical report detailed a forensic nightmare of the Countess Cornelia Bandi. Only a heap of ashes remained. But in the center of those ashes lay her skull. And just like Mary Reeser, the Countess's skull had inexplicably survived, but the brain tissue was entirely gone. More terrifying were the extremities. A short distance from the ashes lay 3 fingers from her hand, blackened but unburnt, and protruding from the pile of cinder were her 2 legs, completely intact from the knee down, still wearing their stockings. Let us pause and examine the parallels. 2 women, both elderly, both alone in a closed room, both reduced to a pile of localized ash. Both left behind a thick, greasy, oily soot that coated the walls and windows. And both left behind unburnt extremities, legs and feet completely untouched by an inferno that melted the rest of their skeletal structure. The bed, just a few feet away from the Countess, was completely unharmed. The linens were not scorched. In 1731, Reverend Bianchini could only hypothesize that a flash of fire had sparked within her breast. Today, we know that is biologically impossible, but the documentation is indisputable. 220 years before Mary Reeser sat in her armchair in Florida, the exact same thermodynamic impossibility occurred in Italy, and it would happen again. If you believe that the cases of Mary Reeser and Countess Bandi were simply the results of antiquated police work or poor historical record-keeping, we must fast-forward 15 years past the Reeser case to a time of modern forensics and color photography. December 5, 1966, Coudersport, Pennsylvania, Dr. John Irving Bentley was a 92-year-old retired physician. He was frail, relying on a walker to get around his modest single-story home. Like Mary Reeser, he was a smoker. He was known to carry matches in his pockets and frequently dropped ashes on his clothing. On a cold December morning, a meter reader named Don Gosnell let himself into Dr. Bentley's house to check the basement utility meters. As he walked through the home, he noticed a light blue smoke hovering near the ceiling. It carried an unusual, sickly sweet odor. Gosnell called out for the doctor. There was no answer. He made his way to the bathroom. What Gosnell found in that bathroom is one of the most chilling photographs in the history of forensic science. The bathroom was not engulfed in flames. The wooden walls were unburnt. The bathtub, just inches away, was merely coated in a fine layer of greasy soot. But in the center of the linoleum floor, there was a hole. It was roughly 2.5 feet wide, burned completely through the floorboards, exposing the basement pipes below. Lying at the edge of this jagged, charred hole was Dr. Bentley's aluminum walker, and resting on the unburnt linoleum, just beside the hole, was the lower half of Dr. Bentley's right leg. It was severed cleanly at the knee, still wearing a brown shoe. The rest of the 92-year-old doctor had been reduced to a pile of red-hot ash in the basement below. The coroner, Dr. John Broadhead, arrived at the scene. He was stunned. To burn through hardwood flooring and completely incinerate a human skeleton requires sustained explosive heat. Yet the rubber tips on Dr. Bentley's aluminum walker, resting right on the edge of the burn hole, had not even melted. The paint on the bathtub next to the hole was not blistered. Once again, the official explanation was the Wick Effect. The theory was that Dr. Bentley dropped a match on his robe, it ignited. He collapsed in the bathroom, and his body fat slowly burned like a candle, localized entirely over that one spot on the floor. But fire investigators raised the same relentless questions. How does a fire burn hot enough to incinerate a human pelvis, but fail to ignite the wooden joists holding up the bathroom floor? Why didn't the draft from the basement turn the localized fire into a raging house fire? And why, yet again, did the lower leg survive? Countess Bandi, Mary Reeser, Dr. Bentley. 3 cases, separated by oceans and centuries, bound together by a macabre, unbreakable pattern. When forensic scientists and fire investigators compile the data on alleged spontaneous human combustion cases, they find a startling uniformity. 1. The victims. They are almost always elderly. They are usually alone. They often have mobility issues, or their senses are dulled by alcohol, sedatives, or sleep. 2. The ignition. There is almost always a plausible external ignition source nearby: a dropped cigarette, a hearth, a dropped match. 3. The localization. The fire burns with shocking vertical intensity, but practically zero horizontal spread. Items sitting inches away are left completely untouched. 4. The residue. A thick yellow or black, oily, foul-smelling residue coats the ceiling and upper walls. 5. The extremities. The torso, where the highest concentration of human body fat resides, is entirely destroyed. The extremities, hands, feet, and lower legs, are miraculously preserved. The Wick Effect perfectly explains the fuel of these fires. The human body, heavily clothed, acts exactly like an inside-out candle. But it fails to explain the anomalies. It fails to explain Mary Reeser's shrunken skull. It fails to explain why the radiant heat doesn't ignite the surrounding room. It fails to explain how a fire can burn hot enough to turn human bone to white ash, a process requiring thousands of degrees, without creating a draft that consumes the building. If the Wick Effect is the only answer, the physics still seem broken. Which leads us to the fringes of science. Because when conventional thermodynamics cannot explain the evidence in room 1, researchers are forced to look at the invisible, the highly improbable, and the theoretically terrifying. Could the ignition source have come from inside Mary Reeser? When standard chemistry fails to explain the heat, we must turn to physics, specifically the physics of electricity. If an external flame like a cigarette wasn't the trigger, could the ignition have come from a massive, instantaneous discharge of energy? Some researchers, unsatisfied with the slow burn of the Wick Effect, have proposed that Mary Reeser was the victim of a freak electrical phenomenon. Let us look at the variables in room 1 on that humid July night in 1951. The air in St. Petersburg was thick with humidity. Mary Reeser was wearing rayon and acetate synthetic fabrics notorious for building up static charge. She was sitting in an upholstered armchair, likely filled with horsehair or synthetic stuffing, moving slightly as she dozed. Could a lethal buildup of static electricity have occurred? Under normal circumstances, a static shock is a nuisance, a few thousand volts with negligible amperage, resulting in a tiny spark. But in highly specific rare atmospheric conditions, could the human body act as a capacitor, storing an immense charge until it discharges internally? Larry E. Arnold, a prominent researcher into anomalous physical phenomena and author of A Blaze, has championed the idea of a pyroton, a hypothetical subatomic particle that interacts with human cells to cause combustion. While mainstream physics rejects this, the idea that the body's own electrical field could go haywire remains a persistent theory on the fringe. But there is another electrical theory that is far more terrifying and slightly more grounded in observed reality: ball lightning. Ball lightning is a rare, unexplained atmospheric phenomenon. It appears as a glowing spherical orb of electricity, ranging from pea-size to several meters in diameter. It has been documented for centuries, often seen during thunderstorms, floating through walls, moving down chimneys, and sometimes violently exploding. Could a sphere of ball lightning have entered Mary Reeser's apartment? Proponents of this theory point to the localized nature of the damage. Ball lightning is known to contain immense energy within a confined space. If an orb of plasma entered the room through an open window or down a chimney flute, floated toward Mary Reeser, and discharged its energy upon contact, it could theoretically provide the instantaneous, intense heat required to incinerate her body and fuse the gears of her clock at 4:20 a.m. It would explain why the newspapers next to her didn't burn. The energy was entirely contained within the electrical sphere until contact. However, there were no thunderstorms reported over St. Petersburg that night. No one saw glowing orbs. And crucially, ball lightning is fleeting. It lasts seconds. It does not explain the sustained multi-hour burn required to turn bone into ash. The electrical theories offer a spectacular ignition source, but they fail to explain the prolonged duration of the fire. If the fire didn't come from a cigarette, and it didn't come from the sky, could it have come from beneath the ground? We enter now the realm of the truly fringe, the geomagnetic hypothesis. This theory posits that certain locations on Earth are situated over ley lines or areas of intense geomagnetic flux. These invisible energy fields, according to proponents, can interact with the human body in bizarre ways. Some researchers have tried to map cases of alleged spontaneous human combustion, claiming they cluster in specific geographic areas. The theory suggests that a fluctuating magnetic field could, under incredibly rare circumstances, induce a current within the human body, specifically within the iron-rich hemoglobin of the blood or the electrical pathways of the nervous system. Could Mary Reeser have been sitting in a geoactive zone in her armchair at 1200 Cherry Street? Could a sudden spike in the Earth's local magnetic field have caused her internal tissues to rapidly heat up, essentially cooking her from the inside out like a biological microwave? This theory attempts to explain the most baffling aspect of SHC, the internal ignition. If the heat starts inside the body, it would explain why the torso, the core, is destroyed first, and why clothing sometimes appears to burn from the inside out. Yet, geologists and physicists dismiss this entirely. There is no evidence that geomagnetic fields can generate the thermal energy required for combustion. St. Petersburg, Florida, is not known for anomalous magnetic activity. And even if it were, why Mary? Why that night? Why only her and not the neighbors on the other side of the wall? Like the electrical theories, the geomagnetic hypothesis provides a fascinating what-if, but crumbles under the weight of scientific scrutiny. It is a theory desperately searching for evidence, which brings us back to the most grounded and perhaps the most disturbing alternative theory of them all. Forget ball lightning. Forget geomagnetic fields. Forget spontaneous combustion. What if the answer is far more human and far more evil? What if Mary Reeser was murdered? This is the theory that suggests spontaneous human combustion is nothing more than a convenient myth used to cover up a heinous crime. Let us look at the facts through the lens of a homicide investigation. Mary Reeser was a widow. She lived alone. On the night of her death, she had taken powerful sedatives. She was vulnerable. The murder theory posits that someone entered Mary's apartment between 8:30 p.m. on Sunday and 8 a.m. on Monday. They found Mary asleep or groggy in her chair. They killed her, perhaps via strangulation or a blow to the head, methods that would leave no trace after a fire. And then the killer needed to destroy the evidence. Proponents of this theory suggest the killer knew about the Wick Effect. Even if they didn't know the name, they knew that a body could be made to burn away completely if given enough time and accelerant. The theory suggests the killer doused Mary's body in the armchair in a flammable liquid, lighter fluid, gasoline, or alcohol. They lit the fire, ensured it caught, and then quietly slipped out into the night, locking the door behind them. The accelerant would have provided the initial intense heat needed to get the fat rendering quickly. The Wick Effect would then take over, consuming the body over the next several hours while the killer established an alibi. Why the localized damage? Because the killer didn't want to burn the building down. A massive apartment fire brings immediate attention. Fire trucks, neighbors, police. A slow, smoldering fire in a closed room can burn all night without anyone noticing, giving the perpetrator hours to escape. Does this explain the anomalies? The shrunken skull? Perhaps the accelerant burned hotter than a standard wick fire, causing unusual deformation before the Wick Effect took over. The unburnt newspapers. The killer may have carefully moved them out of the way to prevent the fire from spreading. But who? Mary Reeser had no known enemies. There were no signs of forced entry. The door was still hot to the touch when Pansy Carpenter tried it, and the painters had to force it open. Robbery was ruled out, as her jewelry was found in the ashes. The FBI considered murder. They investigated local persons of interest. But without a suspect, without a motive, and with a crime scene reduced to ash, they could prove nothing. The murder theory converts an impossible supernatural event into a cold, calculated human atrocity. It is plausible, it is terrifying, but like every other theory in Room 1, it remains unproven. Decades passed. The ashes of Mary Reeser were buried, but her case file remained a battlefield for fringe theorists and forensic scientists. It wasn't until the late 20th century that modern science finally caught up to the anomalies of Room 1. To definitively prove or disprove the FBI's Wick Effect theory, scientists needed to recreate the horrific conditions of that July night, but they could not use a human body in 1998. For a BBC television program called QED, Dr. John DeHaan, a leading forensic fire investigator, orchestrated a groundbreaking experiment. He sought to replicate the exact thermodynamic environment of a spontaneous human combustion case. Dr. DeHaan used a dead pig. Pigs have a body fat percentage and tissue structure remarkably similar to humans. He wrapped the pig carcass in a cotton blanket to simulate Mary Reeser's rayon nightgown and robe. He placed the wrapped carcass in a furnished room, and then he ignited the blanket with a small amount of gasoline, replicating the smoldering ember of a dropped cigarette. The results were a terrifying vindication of the FBI's 1951 theory. The blanket ignited. The heat melted the pig's subcutaneous fat, which soaked into the charred cotton. For the next 7 hours, the fire burned. It did not explode. It did not spread to the surrounding furniture. It burned with a low, localized, intensely hot flame, reaching temperatures of roughly 1,470 degrees Fahrenheit. Because the fire was localized and fueled entirely by the slow rendering of animal fat, the radiant heat was minimal. Just as in Mary Reeser's apartment, items just a few feet away remained entirely unburnt. When Dr. Dehan extinguished the fire, the results were identical to the photographs of Room 1. The flesh was gone. A significant portion of the bone had been reduced to white ash, and the extremities, which hung outside the immediate pool of melting fat, were perfectly preserved. Science had successfully manufactured spontaneous human combustion. There was nothing spontaneous about it. It was a slow, grim, and entirely natural chemical reaction. The Wick effect was proven, but one glaring, impossible anomaly remained. The anomaly that terrified Dr. Wilton Krogman in 1951, the shrunken skull. How does a human skull shrink symmetrically to the size of a teacup? Modern forensic anthropologists now have the answer: it doesn't. When a human skull is subjected to the intense heat of a Wick effect fire, the moisture inside the bone evaporates, the bone matrix calcines, becoming incredibly brittle. The skull does not shrink. It fractures, splinters, and crumbles. So what did the police chief and the coroner see in the ashes of Mary Reeser's chair? Modern forensic analysts reviewing the 1951 case files and photographs have reached a stark conclusion. The investigators made a mistake. What they found was not a shrunken skull. It was almost certainly a globular mass of fused cervical vertebrae, the bones of the neck mixed with melted fat and ash. In the traumatic, unprecedented shock of the crime scene, the local police, looking for recognizable human shapes in a pile of debris, saw a rounded, calcified mass and misidentified it as a skull. Dr. Krogman, working off reports and photographs rather than the undisturbed physical evidence, trusted the initial police assessment. The greatest supernatural anomaly of the Mary Reeser case was, in fact, a simple error in human perception. If science has solved the mechanics of the fire, why does the legend of spontaneous human combustion endure? Why are we still talking about Mary Reeser over 70 years later? The answer lies not in chemistry, but in psychology. We are terrified of our own bodies. We like to believe that we are in control of our physical vessels. The idea of SHC represents the ultimate betrayal of biology. It taps into a primal fear that without warning, without an enemy, and without a cause, the very fat and tissue that sustain us could turn into the fuel that destroys us. Mary Reeser became an urban legend because her death represented a random, inescapable doom. But the truth is far more tragic and far more ordinary. Mary Reeser was a grieving widow. She missed her home in Pennsylvania. She took sedatives to find a few hours of peace, and she smoked a cigarette for comfort. She fell asleep. She dropped the cigarette. She never felt any pain. The barbiturates kept her in a deep, dreamless sleep, while the carbon monoxide in the smoke quietly stopped her heart long before the flames ever reached her. There were no ghosts in Room 1. There was no ball lightning, no geomagnetic anomalies, and no murderous cover-up. On July 10th, 1951, chemistry, physics, and a tragic series of mundane events aligned perfectly. The seconal, the rayon, the cigarette, the body fat. Mary Reeser did not spontaneously combust. She was the victim of the Wick effect, a phenomenon so rare and so visually horrifying that it broke the minds of the men who discovered it. Her legacy is not a supernatural warning. Her legacy is the advancement of forensic fire science. Because of the ashes left in her apartment, investigators around the world now understand how fire can hide, how it can sustain itself, and how it can trick the eye. The case of the Cinder Lady is closed. And that brings us to the end of our monumental, a deep dive into the legendary case of Mary Reeser. If you made it through this entire documentary, thank you. You now know more about the forensics of the Wick effect, the history of SHC, and the truth of Room 1 than almost anyone else on the internet. But I want to know your thoughts. Do you agree with the modern forensic conclusion of the Wick effect? Or do you still think there is a missing piece to the puzzle that science just can't explain yet? Let me know down in the comments. I'll be reading and replying to the most interesting theories. If you appreciate the hundreds of hours of research it takes to put together these feature-length documentaries, please do me a massive favor and hit that like button. It is the #1 way you can support this channel and tell the YouTube algorithm that you want more content exactly like this. If you haven't already, Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next massive historical true crime investigation. Click the video on your screen right now to dive into another unsolved mystery. As always, stay curious, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.